The Souris Valley Photography Club is pleased to present to you this electronic version of our small booklet on the basics of cameras and photography. There are thousands and thousands of books and videos out there that are much more comprehensive than this is. Read and watch everything you can. This volume is intended to be a quick go-to reference guide for learning the basics of how your camera and photography work. Above all, have lots of fun and take even more pictures. This course is consisting of two main parts. The first is on camera essentials, how a camera works, its different modes, the trinity of exposure made up of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed, a section on light stops called Just Stop It, the handheld rule, white balance, composition, and your camera's focus points. Also, we will briefly cover lenses and filters and tripods in a section called Tools for the Job. The second part is called Photography Fun Stuff, and this is different pictures and different kinds of photography, from people to landscapes, horizons, water images, wildlife, sunsets, nighttime pictures, star trails, fireworks, HDR, and macro photography. And lastly, in the conclusion, there is a summary and a quick reference section. The basics of how a camera works is quite simple. Light enters through the lens in the front part of the camera, and there's a mirror there, and that light comes in, bounces up off the mirror so that you can see the picture that you're taking. In the old days, in the film days, there was film back there, but now there is a light sensor. So when you press your camera shutter button, the mirror flips up out of the way, and light comes in and hits this camera's sensor. And then your camera saves the image to the memory card. It's really that simple. That's all there is to it. Cameras have various modes to help you take pictures. There's an automatic mode where the camera does all the thinking for you. You just point and shoot it. It's perfect when you're just beginning. There is also a P or a program mode where you have a bit more control of some of your camera settings. There is an A or an AV mode, which is aperture priority mode. And this one is the one you want when you want to control how much of your picture is in focus, where you control the depth of field. Here's a picture of a digital SLR mode dial with all the four main camera modes of manual, aperture, shutter priority, and program mode, as well as auto and various other programs that this camera has to offer. There's also S or TV mode for shutter priority mode. You use this when you want to either freeze or blur motion. And finally, there's the holy grail of M mode, manual mode, where you control the trinity of exposure yourself, calculating your ISO, your aperture, shutter speed, all by yourself. It's a bit daunting at first, but it does provide you with supreme control of the image and what you want your end result to be. Even if it's wrong, beware, you cannot blame your camera when you use M mode. All right, the trinity of exposure. We all love good photos, and we all hate bad photos that don't turn out because they're too blurry, or they're too dark, or they're too bright. Photos that don't turn out right are usually because the exposure is messed up in some way. Understanding how your camera records the picture you see is the key to nailing your proper exposure every time. The trinity of exposure is the most important thing you can learn about your camera and photography. It is the balance of how ISO, aperture, and shutter speed work together in harmony to produce the image that you envision and want to take a photograph of. So here it is in visual form. Your great photograph is made up of this trinity of exposure, ISO, and aperture and shutter speed. Combinations of all of these things make it happen. These three items control the dynamic of light that is coming into the camera, and therefore exposing or improperly exposing your great photograph. The first thing up is ISO, which is the International Organization for Standardization. Aren't you glad you know that now? It is basically how sensitive to light your camera's sensor is. It is common these days to see ISO settings of 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and even 6400 and beyond. The lower that ISO number is, the smoother your image will be. The higher the ISO, the more grainier the images will be. If you're outside and you've got lots of light, you use low ISO numbers. Inside, in poor or dull light, you increase your ISO to make your camera more sensitive to the available light. Or if you're shooting fast-moving subject like your kid's hockey game, use higher ISOs to freeze the motion. Again, ISOs with low numbers are to be used in lots of light and it produces smooth, clean image quality. High ISO numbers are to be used in low light and it does produce noisier or grainier image quality. You can see the difference here in quality at ISO 200 and ISO 3200. Now on to aperture. The camera lens is like the human eye. The pupil opens wide to let in lots of light when it's dark out, and it gets smaller when there's lots of light. The camera lens does much the same thing, and we call this the aperture. It controls how much light comes into the camera, and then in turn onto the sensor. Aperture is described as an f number or an f-stop. The numbers range from approximately f1.4 to f22, but they do go higher. The smaller the f number, f1.4, the wider the lens opens up, just like your eye in the dark. The larger the f number, f22, the narrower the lens closes down, like your eye in the bright sunshine. It's kind of counterintuitive, but the smaller the f number, the bigger the lens opens up. This visual is more helpful for trying to describe what this is doing. This is the backside of a camera lens at different apertures or f-stops. And so the chart goes from f1.8, and you can see that on the bottom right. It is super wide. It is really, 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 really big, letting in tons of light. And then it is stopped down all the way to f22 in that top left corner. And so it's just almost like a pinhole. It's quite small for when there's lots of light. So you can see what's happening inside the lens as you change these various f-stops. Secondary function of aperture is that it also controls how much of your picture is in focus. Smaller f numbers have very little in focus, while larger f numbers have more of the picture in focus. This concept is called depth of field. An easy way to grasp it is taking a picture down a fence, focusing on the first post in front of you. The smaller the f number, the less of the fence is going to be in focus, probably only the first post. The larger the f number, the more of the whole fence will be in focus, front to back. Here's an example of what I mean. At f2 on the left, you can see that the picture, there's very little in focus. At f8, kind of in the middle of the road, it's about halfway in focus. And then at f16, stopped way down, almost everything in the image is in focus. So you can kind of see the effect of changing the aperture from how wide it is to how small it is and how much of the image is in focus. Portraits are usually taken at smaller f numbers so that the person alone is in focus, while landscapes are usually shot at higher f numbers so that more of the photo is in focus. Now on to shutter speed. We call this a speed, but it is actually a time. The amount of time that light is let into the camera, just like when you blink or close your eye. Shutter speed is measured in seconds and fractions of seconds. Faster shutter speeds are used to stop motion, while slower shutter speeds are used to blur it. If you want to freeze a hummingbird's wings, you need a fast shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second or more. If you want to make running water look really hazy and misty, you'll need a slow shutter speed of maybe 1/15th of a second or less. Shutter speed is measured in seconds and fractions of a second. In the longer time equals a slower shutter speed. And at these speeds, motion is usually blurred. If shutter speed has a shorter time, it is faster, and therefore motion can be frozen. This next section can get a little bit technical, and if at first you don't understand it, doesn't make sense, don't worry. You're not alone. It is a little bit tricky to grasp. And like driving a car, you don't have to know exactly how the car operates in order to drive it. It's the same thing with photography. You don't have to understand all these technical aspects, but man, if you do, it does make your life a little bit better down the road. Because light is everything, and the relationship between ISO, aperture, and shutter speed affect the light being recorded by your camera. So to get this relationship bang on, your camera uses its light meter. Light is measured in stops. That's why we call this section just stop it. But to make an image brighter, you can go up one stop of light, which means you double it. So from ISO 100 to 200. To go darker, you go down one stop. You cut it in half, from 200 to 100. This measurement of a stop of light is exactly the same whether you're talking about ISO, aperture, or shutter speed. It's all the same. You look at this chart, you see that the difference between ISO 100 and 200 is one stop. Also, the difference between f4 and f5.6 is one stop, or one jump. The difference between 1/30th of a second and 1/60th of a second is, you guessed it, one stop. It's all the same. So let's give this a try. You grab your camera and you want to take a picture. You focus the image and click, you're done. The camera's meter measured the light and calculated the exposure at an aperture of f11 and a shutter speed of 125. The camera did its job. The exposure looks great. But what if you don't like it because you don't want f11? It's got too much stuff in focus, too much depth of field. You want more of a portrait kind of a shot. You want less depth of field. You want just the subject in focus. And so you want an aperture of, say, f4. So you grab your handy-dandy chart and you look at this up. So from f11 to f4 is 3 stops, or 3 jumps of light. But if we change the aperture to f4, we have disrupted the harmony of the exposure. If we took the shot without adjusting the shutter speed, the image would end up with too much light. The exposure would be all messed up. It would be completely blown out. So to get a balanced exposure and restore harmony, we would need to adjust the shutter speed up 3 stops to make it right. 3 stops up from 1/25th of a second is 1/1000th of a second. And voila, harmony is restored to the trinity of exposure. Now we have f4 and 1/1000th of a second, and it's exactly the same as f11 at 1/25th. We've moved the same number of stops in both aperture and in shutter speed, so this works out exactly the same, but how we wanted it to be. As I mentioned, if you're sitting there going, huh, and it doesn't make sense, don't worry about it. As you get into photography more, it will make sense in time. What I've just described here is the world of shooting in manual mode. You can also use aperture mode and just let the camera do all that other math for you. And many pro photographers do just this. So now you know why it is called stops. You just want to make the madness stop. There's also a handy handheld rule. It's a rule of thumb for getting a sharp handheld image, which means your camera is not set up on a tripod. The rule states that your shutter speed must be 1 over your lens's focal length. Now, to put this simply, if you have a 18 to 55 millimeter lens and you're zoomed in to 50 mil, then your shutter speed has got to be 1 over 50 to get a sharp shot. If you had a 500 millimeter lens, then your shutter speed must be set to at least 1 over 500th of a second. I'm not going to get into the whole debate about what camera brand to use. As Cliff Motner says, a camera is just a box that lets the light in. So it doesn't really matter what camera you're using. What matters is the skill of the person using the camera. And so that's what we're going to concentrate on. On to white balance. Light is constantly changing, and as a result, your camera is constantly measuring the light with its meter. After the trinity of exposure has been worked out, the color of the scene must be worked out too. Light is measured in temperature, technically in degrees Kelvin, but we're not going to worry about that. Basically, it's the overall color of the scene. When you take pictures, if they're coming out in a yellow or blue cast, then it's probably because the white balance is off. Your camera can guess pretty good, so you can leave it on automatic if you want to. There are other presets you can try, like incandescent, fluorescent, bright, sun, flash, cloudy, or shade. And if you know where you are, like you're outside in the shade, pick shade for the best overall color of the picture. Here's a look at the basic white balance icons. Take a look at them, and when you see them, you'll know what they're all about. Alright, so we've crossed the hurdle of technical stuff. It's now to the artsy, fun side of photography. How your subjects are arranged in your image is all about what composition is. It's just as important as all the other technical stuff we already talked about. So say you're taking a picture of your kid, and you look through your camera's viewfinder to take your picture. Imagine that there is an X's and O's style grid over the entire scene. Some cameras actually have this feature built in. You can turn on and off. Check your menus. Position the kid where one set of the lines intersect. It'll make for the most compelling photograph. This is also called the rule of thirds because you're breaking up your scene into thirds. A picture with one lonely subject in the middle of the grid is really boring. Compose your shot with this rule of thirds in mind, and you will have a winning shot every single time. Hand in hand with composition is where your camera is focusing. The camera uses focus points and allows you to manually choose which one you want, or it will choose it for you if you select autofocus. Most cameras have either 9, 21, or 51 focus points that you can select from. Having the ability to compose the photograph with the focus exactly where you want is an essential skill to learn. When taking pictures of people or wildlife, the focus is almost always on the eye. For landscapes, it may be the window of an old barn, but this is of course completely up to you and your creativity. A great way to practice moving the focus point around in your camera is to watch TV through your camera's viewfinder. Whenever somebody is talking, you focus on their eye. When someone else comes into the scene, change the focus point to the person who's speaking. Keep this up each time the speaker changes. Repeat this exercise until you can do this in the dark with your eyes closed. The more time you spend in photography, the more money you will spend too, usually on lenses. When you buy a camera, you're buying into a lens system. Lenses range in price from a couple $100 all the way up to several $1,000s. Good lenses are always a better investment of money than camera bodies. Why? Because camera bodies become obsolete, but good lenses can always be used with newer camera bodies. Spend the money on the glass. There are essentially two groups of lenses. You've got zoom lenses and you have primes. Zooms give you the ability to zoom, to get closer or farther away from the subject without having to move your feet. Primes give you only one fixed focal length. What you get is what you see. If you want to get closer, you will have to make your feet do the zooming. Basic pointers to keep in mind with lenses are their focal lengths, how wide or how close they can go, and their aperture capability, how wide can those suckers open up. Prime lenses often have wider apertures than zoom lenses, making them perfect for indoor and low light situations. But wider, faster apertures are more costly than slower aperture zooms. Ultimately, what and where you want to take photos of determines what lenses you are going to need. Here's an example of a zoom lens. You read its lens information right here where this arrow is pointing. So this is a Nikon lens, a Nikkor lens. It's 16 to 85 millimeters zoom. And at 16 millimeter, as wide as it gets, the aperture is 3.5 at its maximum. And then when it's zoomed into 85, the aperture is stopped down to f5.6 as its maximum aperture size. So this is a pretty middle of the road kind of zoom lens. Here you see examples of pictures of a zoom lens. So at 16 millimeters, that can of Diet Dr. Pepper is in the middle there, and it is tiny. And you can zoom in closer to 24 millimeters, to 50 millimeters, and then all the way in to 85 mil on that bottom right-hand corner. Here's an example of a prime lens. It's a fixed focal length. It's a 50 mil lens, and we read the lens information there where the arrow is pointing. And it is a max aperture of f1.8, so a pretty fast little nifty 50 millimeter Nikkor lens. And here's the 50 millimeter focal length. What you get is what you see with a prime lens. When buying zoom lenses, keep in mind what focal lengths the lens is going to give you. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have multiple lenses with the same zooming capabilities or the same focal lengths doubling up. If you were to buy a 10 to 24, a 24 to 70, a 70 to 200, and then a 200 to 400, you would have the pretty much complete full range of focal lengths from super wide angle to super telephoto magnification. Filters are always good investments. If nothing else, then an extra level of protection for your lenses. Imagine if you scratched the front of your $800 lens. Eek! A cheap UV haze filter would have saved the day and your pocketbook. Other filters like polarizing filters or neutral density filters, they help cut out glare from images and are primarily used in outside photos. There's a wide range of color filters as well that can add warming and cooling color to your images. The sky is really the limit when it comes to buying filters. Decent tripods are big, they're heavy, and they're a real pain to carry around. And they are a must. especially if you want to do landscapes or wildlife or even in low and crummy light and even for portraits. It doesn't matter how fancy your camera is. If it is shaking, your photos are going to be blurry. Buy the very best tripod that you can afford. Alternatively, you can use bean bags or sandwich bags filled with sand to use as makeshift rests for your camera. Use your timer mode to get around any shake that might happen from pressing down on your camera's shutter button. Or if you have a cable release, you can try using that. But tripods, they are a must. Pictures tell a story. And just as there are many ways to tell a story, there are many ways to take pictures. Here are a few examples and some hints, tips, and tricks to get you started in different kinds of photography. Let's face it, we all buy digital SLRs to take pictures of our kids and our families. We'll fill up hard drives with thousands of pictures of them, and it makes sense that the pictures should be as best as they can be. These tips are for taking general candid type photos. We'll leave formal studio type portrait tips for some other time. A great tip is to use a longer zoom lens. It's key to candid shots because you're further away from your subjects and they're not really even aware that you're taking the picture. Also, try not to use a flash. In low light, crank up your ISO and open your aperture as wide as it'll go. Try f2.8 if your camera lens can do it. The more the better. Try to capture people doing stuff. Activity always adds to the overall story of the image. Multiple subjects also can enhance a photo, adding relationship and emotion to the image. Mix up your perspective too for interesting angles, especially for pics of kids. Get down on their level. Take a shot at 3 feet up instead of 5'7". If you can, compose a shot with the foreground and background out of focus, in effect framing the main subject with out of focus elements. Shoot over somebody's shoulder or a tree branch or a frame of a doorway, whatever's in your way to add a little bit of extra something to your image. Everyone loves nature and beautiful landscapes. Compose these shots using the rule of thirds to draw the eye into and then through the image. Landscapes should have something exciting happening in the foreground to look at. A plant, a rock, boat, leaves, whatever, just something. Then, after the eye is held there for a bit, it moves on through to the background of the image. When I look at this landscape, my eye is immediately drawn to that first dark fence post. Then after it's there for a little while, it kind of follows the fence line out and it sees all those trees in the background and eventually goes up to that glowing sun. And that's kind of what a landscape image should do. It should take you through the photo, from front to back or back to front. Landscapes, they require a tripod or a rest for the best results, so try using one. The aperture mode on your camera is also useful. Add an f-stop of f16 or f22 to get lots of the image in focus. And try taking landscapes in the early morning or just before sunset. These times of the day are called golden light. Everything is warm and glowing and it makes for the richest colors and the best landscapes. The best landscapes and travel photos, they don't put the horizon line right through the middle of the photo. Instead, they use the rule of thirds. If you want to feature the sky in your shot, well, make sure it takes up the top 2/3 of the picture. Or if the ground is more important to you in the image, make sure that it takes up the bottom 2/3. Tripods, level ones, are a must. Everybody loves water, and it provides some really great photographic opportunities as well. You've got two main options when it comes to water that is running, like in a river or a creek. You can freeze the motion or you can blur it. Use shutter mode and dial in as close to 1 second as you can get, the slower the better to blur it. Polarizing filters or neutral density filters also work very well to help you take longer exposures. If you want to freeze motion like your kid kayaking down a rapid, try a fast shutter speed of 1/800. Photographing wildlife is a great way to spend time outside. You will need some key equipment to do it well though. Long-reaching telephoto lenses are a must. 300mm tends to be a minimum. Prime lenses are even better. These kinds of lenses do tend to be rather costly, but the results are worth it. Also, wildlife can see you and smell you before you see them. Using a blind and a tripod is a great way to get up close and personal with your subject. Like in candid photos of people, wildlife are much more relaxed and natural looking when they don't know that you are watching them. Just like any landscape shot, sunsets and sunrises are beautiful. Compose them with interesting foregrounds and backgrounds and use that rule of thirds. One added feature though is the ability to do silhouettes. Put your subject between you and the sun. Use your camera's meter to spot meter the sky, and this will make your subject turn out as a black outline because there's no light hitting them on the front. Sunsets and silhouettes go together like peanut butter and chocolate. One final tip is to make sure that your lens is clean and free from dust before taking the sunset shots. The dust will show up as those ugly little black dots, and they are a real drag to have to deal with, and they look terrible in the overall picture. Nighttime provides some really cool photo opportunities, as well as some challenges. The first of which is there's no light, so you need to find other sources of light to make photos. Give your kids some glow sticks or some sparklers. These things make great night photos. Put your camera in manual mode, dial in your shutter speed to 2 seconds or so, crank your aperture open as wide as it'll go, f4 or wider, and then make sure your flash is set to off. Set your camera up on a tripod or a rest. This will make for some really cool images. You can also try firing your flash to see what kind of interesting effects that creates as well. Another really fun thing to do is use flashlights to actually paint with light. You set up your camera just like before, but with a longer shutter speed of 15 seconds or so. You point flashlights towards your camera and you literally can paint a picture with light. Try wrapping colored tissue paper around the flashlight lens to add color. It is a lot of fun. Star trail photos are super cool. They take a bit more preparation than the average landscape shot, but the end result is really great. It's also better to do this if there is no moon out. Compose your shot with lots of sky showing. Set your camera for the lowest ISO setting it has, 200 or lower for the best quality. A tripod or a rest is a must. Use manual mode and open your aperture up as wide as it'll go, f2.8 or wider if you can, to let in the maximum amount of starlight. Set your shutter speed to bulb, which is basically telling the camera to hold the shutter open until you close it. It's like holding your eyelids open for a really, really long time. But the effects look like this. If you have a remote or a cable release, use it to prevent shake or blur that can happen. You can try setting your white balance to incandescent to give the sky a really, really blue look, or just leave it on auto. When it is pitch black, trip your shutter open and then check your watch. Leave the setup alone for 15 minutes. When you come back, close the shutter. The camera will take another 15 minutes to write the file to the memory card, so don't turn it off. The image will result in a really cool star trail. Everybody loves fireworks, and they also make for some exciting photos. Grab your camera on a fairly wide lens if you're close to the fireworks. Longer lenses will work too if you're further away. If your lens has a lens hood, put it on. If you have a tripod or a rest, use it. Set your ISO to 200 or lower. Put your camera in manual mode. There are many settings you can go with, but try an aperture of f8 and a shutter speed of 5 seconds. This way you'll be recording the fireworks as they go up and explode. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. Unlike the human eye, the camera currently cannot record everything in an image that we see with our eyes, especially that full range of darks and lights in an image. To get a picture that has more of this kind of a range, we have to take several shots and then use computer software to layer them all together to make one HDR image in the end. This method of photography works excellent where there are extreme brights and darks in the same image, like a dark hallway with one super bright window. The camera's meter looks at that scene and doesn't know what to do. HDR to the rescue. So you start by taking a base image that will have more or less the proper exposure. Then you underexpose, which means to take pictures that are purposely darker by a stop, and you overexpose, taking pictures that are purposely brighter by a stop, until you have about 5 images. And that's usually enough to collect a full range of lights and darks. Then you feed all these images into your computer software, either Photomatix or Nik Software's HDRFX Pro, and the software allows you to do further editing and tweak your image to produce some really cool results. Here's some examples of what I mean. This is HDR photography. The pictures on the left, you have the same exact photo, just overexposed and underexposed. And as well, beside them you have the histograms. And photos we know tell a story, but histograms tell you the story of a photo. They are a graphical representation of the lights and the darks of an image. If the ridges are too far to the left or to the right, the image may be over or underexposed. There's no such thing as a wrong exposure, it's just what you have in mind. But if we look at these histograms at the top, we see that the ridges are to the left, so it's underexposed. And at the bottom, the ridges are over on the right-hand side, which means the image is overexposed. The ridges in the middle of the image means it's a fairly balanced shot overall. The wonderful world of macro photography is essentially close-up photography of tiny subjects. There's a whole world of miniature landscapes right at our feet. Macro requires a close-up or a macro or a micro lens. These lenses allow you to focus very close to your subjects, inches close even, much more than regular lenses. Tripods are also very handy to prevent blurry images from camera shake. You can pose macro photos the same way as any other photo, but often getting really close and filling up the whole frame, making for some very, very interesting shots. Macro is a whole lot of fun because you can take great pictures of the world that many people just completely overlook. Macro lenses are also great for doing product photography. 60mm, 85 and 105mm are typical macro lens focal lengths. Here's an example of a macro lens. It's a Nikkor 105mm f2.8, which also makes it really great for portraits because you can get some really good shallow depth of field on this one. Excellent macro lens. Photography can seem overwhelming at first, but after a while all the concepts start to make more and more sense. The more pictures that you take, the better off you're going to be. Experiment with all the settings your camera has to offer. Shoot in automatic mode until you feel you're ready to try the other ones. Keep a little journal of settings that you try and stuff that worked out and stuff that didn't. And soon you won't need to. All this technical stuff will become second nature and you won't even have to think about it. Above all, just have lots of fun. This is just a quick reference about stops. Remember that when you're dealing with the trinity of exposure, we're measuring everything in stops, the doubling or the cutting in half of light. A stop is the same thing for ISO, for aperture, or for shutter speed. It's easy to see the full stop jumps when it comes to ISO. You start at 50 and you go up to 100, 200, 400, 800, and so on. Just remember that you use the small numbers when it comes to having lots of light, and then you use the high numbers when you have low light. Same thing applies for aperture. You can see this if you start with a baseline of f1.0 and f1.4, they double, so it becomes 2 and 2.8, 4 and 5.6, 8 and 11, and so on. And you can just see that you use those wide open apertures in low light and those narrow apertures when you have lots of light, but you're still always just doubling them. Same thing applies with shutter speed when it comes to stops. You can start out with a baseline of 1 second and get faster to a half second, a quarter, an eighth, a 15th, a 30th, and so on. Just remember that the long time is a slow shutter speed and a short time is a fast shutter speed, but you're still basically just doubling it when it comes to these fractions. If you read photography books or watch photography videos, you're eventually going to hear people talk about thirds of a stop, or I had to go down a third of a stop, or 2/3. Well, besides going up in whole stops, you can also go up in thirds, and so this allows you to fine-tune your exposure even more so.